Today, we'd like to tell you the story of one of the most fascinating men of our time. His name, Powel Crosley, Jr. The story of Powel Crosley, Jr. is not only the story of an unusually talented and far-sighted man, it's the story of a city, of the entire American way of life. It's the story of broadcasting and baseball, of automobiles and airplanes, of inventions and contraptions. It contains humor and pathos. It spans the panorama of the 20th century.
The voice of Peter Grant. What memories that holds for me. He was an idol of mine when first I walked up these steps. I came here as a young announcer, a job that fulfilled my childhood dreams. This building is known as Crosley Square. Today, it houses WLWT. I had sung on WLW's Chance of a Lifetime at the Arlington Street Studios back in 1939. After World War II, when I came to work here, it held the radio studios of Crosley Broadcasting, home of WSAI and the international powerhouse WLW, the nation's station. I suppose it's difficult for people born in later years to realize what a tremendous influence radio broadcasting had on our generation. As a youngster, I was so enamored by the magic of radio, I used to walk home from school with my hand cupped around my ear the way I'd seen announcers in radio fan magazines do it. Practicing, practicing, practicing.
The Nation Station, home of Crosley Broadcasting.
Such was the mystique of the radio empire created by Powel Crosley Jr. And I wasn't the only kid on my block to harbor such ambitions. When we were young, we played out our fantasies. We didn't take particular note of the 20th century marvels being introduced, and we were blissfully unaware of the contributions being made to our world by Cincinnati's native son, Powel Crosley Jr. Powel Crosley was only 13 years old when the world welcomed the 20th century. You don't hear much about the 20th century today. If anything, we're prone to look forward to the 21st. But at the turn of the century, Americans shared an unbounded optimism for the future. The 20th century would be a time of technological miracles, and those wonders would be made available to everyone. The dream did come true. More miracles than anyone might have guessed. But to Powel Crosley, a young boy growing up in Cincinnati and dreaming of designing and racing motor cars on the great road circuits of the world, those early years of the 20th century were times of endless fascination. Fascination with almost anything mechanical. Fascination with the way things worked. Fascination with the limitless possibilities that a developing world seemed to be supplying with each passing day. The automobile, the electric light, the phonograph, the flying machine, the wireless radio. And Powel Crosley Jr., the young boy who dreamed of racing motor cars, was destined to make a number of America's 20th century dreams come true. He was born in the Walnut Hills section of Cincinnati to a lawyer father and a devoted mother. In 1893, when he was 7, the family moved to College Hill, where Crosley and his brother Lewis attended Ohio Military Institute. He was wildly interested in automobiles. When he was but 13 years old, he experienced early success as both an inventor and as an entrepreneur. He had drawn up the design for his own electric car. He wanted desperately to build it, but he had no money to buy the necessary parts. He badgered his brother Lewis until Lewis loaned him his entire savings, $8. The budding entrepreneur then approached a skeptical parent. He coaxed his father to pay him $10 if they could build the car and make it run. The car was built, and it did run. Powel got his $10 and paid Lewis back the $8 he had borrowed. He then split his $2 profit with his brother. That early partnership was to last a lifetime. When he was of age, Powel entered the University of Cincinnati's School of Law to please his lawyer father. He soon became bored. His sister remembers how a teacher and friend of the family convinced Powell's father that his son was destined for other pursuits.
She called my father in and said, that I think you ought to drop this law business with your son, because he has a photographic mind and he can do many, many other things better than law work. And that disappointed my father very much.
Powell made the switch to engineering and quickly outstripped his teachers and classmates. After 2 years, he again became bored. He left school to indulge in a number of enterprises, most of them having to do with automobiles. He took jobs as a chauffeur so he could drive the biggest, fastest, and most powerful cars of the day. He worked as a lineman, a bond salesman, owned an advertising agency, bought and sold an automobile dealership, built and raced a gasoline-engined race car. He had wanted to compete in the Indianapolis 500 until an accident convinced him that the world and his young bride would be better served if he put his ideas to work in the auto industry.
I remember the day that he bought this business. He paid $500 for it, and my father lent it to him because he didn't have $500. And he called it the automobile accessory business.
And so Crosley turned to making accessories for automobiles. His first product was an inexpensive tire liner for the notoriously unreliable rubber tires of the day. He followed this success with a number of products that owners could add to the popular Model T Ford. One of his innovations was an inside starter. That was inspired by a broken arm caused by the vicious backspin of the crank of his own car. During World War I, his American Automobile Accessories Company marketed a flag holder that fit on the radiator cap of the Model T. Patriotic Ford owners rushed to display their country's flag on the hood of their cars. That small item helped Crosley attain substantial financial success. By the end of the war, he had become a millionaire.
At that time, the Crosley family lived in the heart of College Hill, right here on Davie Street. Crosley's success had come after he married, after he had a family, and after a restless early life that seemed to hold little promise of the achievements to come. His automobile accessory business had made him rich, but his restless mind continued to seek new worlds to explore. It was here in this quiet Cincinnati neighborhood that Powel Crosley Jr. discovered a new obsession, one that would take his mind off his love for automobiles for some time to come.
The year was 1921. Crosley's son, Powel Crosley III, came to him pleading for a unique toy. The toy was called a radio, and it was an intriguing device that allowed you to hear voices through the air. Crosley wanted to see and hear this new wonder for himself. He and his son went shopping for a radio. Tom Muir, a boyhood friend of Powell III's, remembers that day.
And when they came back, they did not have a crystal set. And Powell Jr. was very upset. And his father pranced up and down on the porch, as he often did, with his hands behind him, mumbling to himself in shorthand or something I didn't understand, and saying at that time, the idea of charging that much for that little thing, well, I could build that for half that price.
Prices ranged from $130 to $150, and in those days, a family man's salary ran between $12 and $15 a week. Instead of buying an expensive radio, Crosley bought the parts. Taking them home, he assembled his first Crosley radio. Total cost? Approximately $35.
At the time, he owned a small automobile accessories factory. This is where it was, in this building at 1601 Blue Rock Street on the west side. Crosley employed 2 young engineering students from the University of Cincinnati.
And that's when he came up to the university and hired myself and my co-op partner, Dorman Israel.
He brought them the radio he had built for his son. He had them follow his design and then improve upon it. More important, he had them make it cheap enough so that almost anyone could afford one. Elmer Hentz recalls early difficulties in getting stores like L.T. Milner's to carry Crosley radios.
I know Powell and I, we went down there together. He took the business end of it, and I took the technical end of it, you know. And LT finally agreed to handle our radio if we could demonstrate to the people down there in the store that what you was doing in the front end of the store was being reproduced in the back end of the store on the speaker. Now that's how skeptical people were.
Well, this building bears no historical plaque, but it should. Within these walls was born the mass-produced, inexpensive radio. And for better or worse, once that genie was out of the bottle, the world would never be the same again.
His next step was to have his two UC co-ops build a 20-watt radio transmitter. His first experimental programs came from the family's hand-wound phonograph. The first record selection, The Song of India. As a matter of fact, it was also the second, third, and fourth selections as Crosley played the favorite disc over and over. His daughter, Paige Crosley-Kess, remembers those early experiments.
Well, he started Crosley broadcasting, such as in his house in the billiard room upstairs. And he had equipment, as I say, all over the place, and cabinets and wires running here and there, and he had microphones and all that kind of paraphernalia.
Powel Crosley started his broadcasting empire because he wanted to sell radios. He was convinced they would become more than a rich man's toy or a passing fad. The first radio marketed under the Crosley name was a coupled crystal model. Crosley called it the Harco. The Harco was followed by a more sophisticated one-tube model, and then more and more models. Those early Crosley radio sets were fabulous successes. Not at all surprising. Crosley radio sets were underselling their competitors by as much as $100, and that included antenna and earphones. The competition rushed to meet the challenge, but Crosley had stolen the low-priced market. It was his initiative that brought low-cost radio within the reach of the average American family and earned him the title, the Henry Ford of radio.
I think he went in the radio with that intention of being the Ford of radio. If one guy would bring a radio set out for $150, Crosley would have one just as good, if not better, for maybe $120.
And that's what he tried to do all of his life, to make something cheaper so the public could afford to buy it.
Crosley soon realized that listeners would have to have quality programming if radio was to last beyond the fad stage. In March of 1922, Crosley traded in his experimental 8CR transmitter for a more powerful 500-watt model with a range of 200 miles and farther. The call letters of his newly licensed radio station, WLW, were heard for the first time.
And he was so thrilled when WLW was given to him. I remember that night very well. It had just come through from the government, and he was allotted WLW, and we all danced. And he was so happy and so pleased.
The station began by offering live music broadcasts. Arnold Bluedow, a musician from Doherty's Melody Boys, one of the first WLW orchestras, tells what it was like to play in the studio at Crosley's North Side factory.
Went over backstairs and went in the back room, and we thought, where are we going? It looked like some kind of workshop or something. And finally again he said, well, here's where we broadcast. And everybody had to take their place, and as they took their place, they would set up the microphones accordingly, but nobody could say nothing until we got the go from the red light, and we'd start up the orchestra, we'd play the orchestra.
Those first efforts at broadcasting would give way to more and more sophisticated programs. Their echoes live in the memories of those who heard them. Remember?
We take you now to Cincinnati.
An evening at Crosley Square.
Here's a friendly invitation from the Crosley Corporation.
Come spend an evening at Crosley Square. A friendly greeting awaits you there.
Forget when our lips met under the moon.
I've known you so long and loved you so much. I'll always be glad I met you.
Took a monkey for a ride in the air. The monkey thought that everything was on the square. The bugs were trying along his head, St. Mary, down at Mississippi. Apple Jack and goods like Mary will have a tambourine.
Come spend an evening at Crosley Square. A friend.
Crosley's competitors had to rush to keep up. The marketing strategy of selling affordable radios and supplying WLW's listeners with a quality program service was a resounding success.
By 1922, his automobile parts factory was turning out 500 crystal sets a day. Radio manufacturing had far outstripped his other ventures, and Crosley realized he had a tiger by the tail. He entered this whole new field by happenstance, but it would consume his attention for years to come.
The 500-watt transmitter was soon upgraded to 5,000 watts, and his automobile parts business was renamed the Crosley Manufacturing Company. Crosley continued to expand and improve his facilities. In 1925, the manufacturing plant moved to a building on Coleraine in Cincinnati's Camp Washington district. He installed his increasingly popular radio station on the 4th floor. WLW was given larger, more modern studios with the latest equipment and design features. As the radio audience grew and the manufacturing company sold more and more sets, Crosley was required to fight a continuing series of legal and legislative battles to protect and bolster the infant broadcast industry. He battled the telephone companies and powerful newspaper interests who were lobbying hard against the spread of radio and the beginning of radio advertising. He won out when the government signed the license for a 50,000-watt transmitter. Crosley purchased radio station WSAI, and the 50,000-watt WLW transmitter was constructed at the WSAI transmitter site in Mason, Ohio. It was May of 1928, and America was riding the crest of a heady wave of prosperity. The restless Crosley was not content with his new 50,000-watt radio station. He and his engineers started to talk and plan for an even more ambitious facility. They finally came up with a design for a transmitter that would supply WLW with an unheard-of 500,000 watts of AM power. WLW already carried the title the nation's station. This would guarantee them a national reputation for years to come. The political obstacles to the licensing of such a broadcasting Goliath were formidable. Right in the midst of Crosley's lobbying efforts, the Great Depression of 1929 delivered a gut-wrenching blow to America's breadbasket. But Crosley was not to be deterred. He carried his cause to the highest office in the land, the President of the United States. Radio, he advocated, was the cheapest form of entertainment available to a poverty-stricken nation. Besides, it was the most effective way for a crusading president to get his message directly to the people. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who was to create the fireside chat, understood what Powel Crosley was talking about. On May 2nd, 1934, he sat at his desk in the White House and threw a switch that supplied the first electrical current to the most powerful radio station on the face of the earth. Howard Lepple, a former chief engineer at WLW Radio, remembers being terrified the night that Powel Crosley introduced his new 20th century marvel to a waiting world.
They had a group out at the transmitter, and he dedicated it from there. It was a brand new high-powered design, and there were a lot of engineering firsts in the design of it. If the power was too high, it would go off the air. If you got the voice level too high, the station would go off the air.
By this time, both the Crosley manufacturing plant and the radio stations had been moved to this building. You can still see the Crosley C above the door. It's now occupied by the Hart Hanks Corporation. The radio studios were on the 8th floor, and in 1932, they were acknowledged to be the most modern in the country, more modern than New York, Chicago, or Hollywood. Sid Tenike of the historically famous Doodle Sockers radio show remembers moving into the Arlington Street studios.
Starting in 1930, we had these beautiful new studios on the 8th floor on Arlington Street. They were the very last word. Studio, it was a great, big, tremendous thing with lighting and colors all around it, modernistic to the last degree. 4 years later, I go to NBC in New York at 711 Fifth Avenue, and they still had the monk's cloth hanging on the walls. 4 years after WLW had these beautiful new studios. And of course, all of this was the brainchild of Powel Crosley.
The brainchild of Powel Crosley. He had his office up there on the 8th floor, watching over his manufacturing and his broadcasting world. And oh, what an array of talent he brought through these portals.
It featured the performances of stars bound for glory. The Mills Brothers.
Way up in the blue.
And boy, what celebrities were there. Errol Flynn walked out on the stage and all the girls went, oh. I walked out on the stage and all the girls went,
Fats Waller.
Be sure it's true when you say I love you. It's a sin to tell a lie.
Doris Day.
I know by your voice, but you're always so far away.
And a host of others. It was the birthplace of that phenomenon, the daytime soap opera. The most successful soap opera ever broadcast to American radio audiences began at Crosley's Arlington Street studios.
Now, in the starlight, we find Mr. Powell and Ma sitting in the porch swing in earnest conversation. Ma's just saying,
And there's no doubt in your mind, Mr. Powell, none whatsoever, that Stella didn't marry Gary just for money.
Well, I talked to her. All she could say, all she could think of was just that she wanted to think it over.
And you believe, as Matilda does, that that meant she wanted to set a price.
WLW's programming was tops, and the distribution was even better.
WLW's tower here in Mason radiated so much power that nearby residents had trouble turning off their electric lights. Stories abound of wire fences that picked up and broadcast WLW programs. It was claimed that some people received WLW in their dental fillings. Well, be that as it may, it certainly was true and documented that WLW's programs were now heard by Eskimos in the far north and by missionaries in the jungles of the Amazon.
WLW's 500,000-watt transmitter was the most powerful AM in the world and an awe-inspiring sight. Its transformers weighed close to 50 tons, and it took over 500 gallons of distilled water every operating minute to cool its giant vacuum tubes, and an additional 700 gallons of tap water a minute to cool the distilled water heated by those tubes. Crosley considered it his crowning achievement in the field of radio. When the government reversed its decision in 1939 and severely restricted the use of the powerful 500,000-watt transmitter, some say it caused Crosley to become disillusioned with radio broadcasting. Even his early supporter, FDR, couldn't ignore the overwhelming pressure from newspaper, telephone, and broadcast lobbyists. Powell's niece, Lyda Montgomery, talks of his disappointment.
Roosevelt approved of it and then knocked it. And his heart was broken then because he was the most powerful station in the world. In fact, I have a friend that lived in Australia and said, well, they got WLW better than they got anything else. But then he was knocking out everything else, and they didn't like that. Every other little station was being whopped.
WLW's 500,000-watt transmitter was the electronic marvel of the age. It lies asleep now in the WLW transmitter building here in Mason. It's been stripped of many of its essential parts and rests rather ignominiously behind stacks of stored boxes and piles of obsolete equipment.
But during WLW's heyday, Powell's Let's Do It Now spirit brought about the creation of entertaining radio programs as well as technological advances. Mary Wood, longtime radio and TV columnist, remembers how one of WLW's longest-running radio series was created.
But if Powel Crosley, who owned the station, had ever known how Moon River, or where Moon River got started, I don't think he would have been as happy about it as he was. One of the top producers at the time was a lovely fellow named Eddie Byron. And one afternoon, Powel Crosley came to Eddie and he said, Eddie, I've just bought this wonderful organ, which I'm dedicating to my mother, and I would like a program of organ music, you know, soft music, romantic and romantic poetry on the air, say at midnight tomorrow night. Well, I mean, you know, Mr. Crosby wanted things done yesterday. And Eddie began to shake, and so after the station was off the air that night, Eddie and one of the well-known violinists of the station, Virginio Marucci, repaired to a speakeasy down on Court Street. It was a speakeasy which was, well, it was run by a madam. You see, this is Prohibition days. And also there were lots of charming waitresses there. So he gets down there and he has a few drinks, and he's thinking of the days when he grew up on the Ohio River and the moon was on the river. And he thought, moon river, and he began to write. And Virginio Marucci is playing one of his favorite pieces, the Caprice Via Moi. Eddie is reading the portrait, and Virginio is playing the violin. The ladies are coming in and out, and they're beginning to cry. And Eddie said, by God, I knew I had it. And that was the birthplace of Moon River, which was probably, I would say, the most romantic of all the programs.
Moon River, a lazy stream of dreams, where vain desires forget themselves in the loveliness of sleep. Moon River, enchanted white ribbon, twined in the hair of night, where nothing is but sleep. Dream on, sleep on, care will not seek for thee. Float on, drift on, Moon River, to the sea.
During the 1920s and early 30s, radios were not the only items produced by the Crosley Corporation. Crosley tried his hand at many different consumer items with varying degrees of success. When he built his first radio, his automotive parts business was languishing. He was already trying his hand at building canoes, which were not too successful, and at building gramophones, which were somewhat more successful. The skills acquired making gramophone cabinets gave his employees experience that was later put to good use building radio cabinets. In the mid-1920s, he designed a simple and inexpensive gas refrigerator called the Icy Ball. Paul Gorel, a collector of Crosley memorabilia, explains how it works.
This is the Crosley Icy Ball unit. This is the Icy Ball. To recharge the system, you turn it around, put this ball in a bucket of water on a kerosene burner to regenerate the system for 45 minutes every day, and then reverse it back around. This ball has a hole in it for the ice cube tray, and you put it back in the box. And then as the ammonia escapes back into the ball that we heated and forced it out of, the exhaust part of the Ventura in there causes a cooling. That gives you refrigeration in the home before you had electricity.
For many years, Crosley Manufacturing continued to receive thank you letters from isolated tropical and desert outposts where the Icy Ball was the only means for civilized persons to make ice cubes to cool their drinks. A number of them continue to be used to this day.
Crosley worked on the development of a 35mm camera. This is the prototype. He abandoned the design when the pot metal housing developed light leaks, an omen of problems he would later experience when developing car engines. Then there was the somewhat embarrassing Extravac. Embarrassing because it was the object of a government lawsuit. The suit charged that the vacuum device could not coax the growth of new hair, as Crosley's advertising claimed. However, Louis Crosley remembers his grandfather's faith in his own product.
He had one in his bathroom, and he did use it religiously as he got balder and balder. And I remember this crazy cap sitting on his head with a rubber skirt to make a tight seal, and the hose coming out of the top, and it.
And so, not every product developed by Crosley was a resounding success, not by a long shot. His sister advised him against developing a speedy tandem seat roadster after accompanying him on a hair-raising ride.
I said, "Pal, you don't have to think that you're going to sell that car, because you aren't." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you were up there and I was back here. If I was a girlfriend, you'd want a hug." Oh, I never thought of that. And he said, "I believe you got something there." And he was very disappointed because the motor was good and we did go like the wind. I can feel my hair blowing to this day.
However many unsuccessful ventures he may have engaged in, there was one development that made a tremendous contribution to his company's fortunes.
Crosley was noted for taking the time to talk to any inventors, tinkerers, or gadgeteers who wanted to talk about their ideas. Many of those ideas were exchanged right here in this room. This is the office that Crosley occupied on the 8th floor at Arlington Street. It's as he left it. The imported wood paneling, the ornate fireplace, the leaded casement windows. It lacks his desk, his office furniture, his personal effects. They're all gone now. The room is currently used for conferences and training sessions by Hart Hanks. We don't know for sure, but this office might well have been the scene of a legendary meeting.
One day, Crosley was confronted by a somewhat distraught young man who wanted to sell the rights to an idea he had patented. The young man thought that putting storage shelves on the door of a refrigerator would come in handy. Crosley thought so too. He offered the inventor a 25-cent royalty on every Crosley refrigerator made with door shelves. The man wanted $15,000 cash. He wouldn't listen to Crosley's argument that the royalties would make him rich. He was adamant. The discussion became heated. Crosley offered a combination of cash and royalties, but the inventor would not be dissuaded. Finally, in exasperation, Crosley wrote him a check for $15,000.
And this is the result, the famous Crosley Shelvador refrigerator. Not too impressive, maybe, when compared with the modern-day appliances, but with its convenient door shelves, it was the wonder of the day to housewives in the 1930s. It was an instant success. Hundreds of thousands were made and sold. Competing manufacturers could only wait in frustration until Crosley's patent rights ran out. In the meantime, Crosley's Shelvador had become one of the most popular household appliances in America. It lifted Crosley earnings to new heights in spite of the hard times of the 30s.
In 1930, 31, 32, 33 was the deep part of the Depression. I worked at WLW and the factory was full. The factory was running full blast. His brother Louis Crosley was in charge of the factory.
Bill Angert remembers the brothers as North College Hill neighbors.
But together they made a great team. Paul had the ideas. It was Louis's job to get it done. And he certainly did a good job of it. Two very unique people that certainly blended well together.
The ever-restless Crosley began experimenting with a home receiver that printed out a one-sheet newspaper. Invented and patented by Captain William G.H. Finch, a few of these devices were placed in Cincinnati homes. The Crosley Company fed them an overnight news service that operated for a number of years.
During the Second World War, he had one running 24 hours a day in his living room. And, of course, he had it tuned into, I assume, WLW, but anyway, to the news broadcasts, and especially at night. And he would get this whole roll of tape in the mornings while he'd sit there with the extravac on his head and read the war news that occurred during the night.
His manufacturing company turned out many different items. The Crosley Company was a leader in the design and manufacture of a number of radio's innovations. Crosley developed the first production car radio, the Romeo, and it was the pride and joy of many a young swain of the day. Crosley introduced the first porcelain-based radio vacuum tube sockets and perfected their design. Other companies bought them for use in their own radio sets, a testament to Crosley quality. No story about the accomplishments of Crosley Broadcast Engineering would be complete without mention of the superb team of talented engineers that Powel Crosley assembled. Many of his radio empire's trailblazing advances came from the creative minds of his engineers. Under Powell's guidance, Jim Rockwell and the Crosley engineers started designing and developing television broadcasting equipment. They produced Cincinnati's first television broadcast in 1939. That same year saw Powell return to his first love with the introduction of the Crosley automobile at Indianapolis. One of the nation's first small cars, it was meant to occupy the garage of every average American family. It was the fuel-efficient little wonder that would be the answer to rising gasoline prices. It was Crosley's dream and his passion. It was even featured at the 1939 World's Fair with Mayor LaGuardia. There were two models, and they were powered by a two-cylinder engine. He became so involved in the car's production that he gradually lost interest in his radio stations and the successful manufacturing company. World War II put a hold on Crosley's plans. All of his manufacturing energies were directed toward the war effort. Because of the sensitive nature of the work being done in the Arlington Street facility, the WLW studios were forced to move to a building on 9th and Elm. This was to become Crosley Square. After the war, he sold his remaining interest in the radio broadcasting business and the appliance manufacturing company to his wartime partners, the Avco Corporation. Now he could focus all his attention on his first love.
This is the Crosley car I remember best, the post-war Crosley. The cars had been completely restyled during the war years. They were the talk of the town, and they had some revolutionary new features. The post-war models of the Crosley car used a more powerful, new, lightweight engine.
The entire car weighed little more than 1,200 pounds, making it far more fuel efficient than Detroit models. The initial sales year, 1947, saw the post-war Crosley making a modest profit. The number of models was expanded to 5, and a small truck was developed. Bill Angert, a longtime fan and collector of Crosley automobiles, described some of the features and weaknesses of the various models.
Well, the Crosley automobile is particularly interesting because it is a unique, small, a little bit different kind of a car than we had at the time that it was popular. This is a 1941 model. It was a two-cylinder car, an air-cooled engine. They advertised this at 50 miles to a gallon. This particular car here sold in 1941 for $370. There was somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 to 5,000 of these made. First post-war Crosleys that were made were all a two-door sedan that would seat 4 people. Crosley had in 1949 and 50 a 4-wheel disc brake automobile. This is many, many years before anyone else even had disc brakes on an automobile. Another thing about Powell is he was a person that was never satisfied without constantly developing another model, something different. The real story, of course, and the thing that most people remember about Crosley cars is a engine he devised and came out with in '46, right after World War II. And it was a product built with about 120 pieces of sheet metal, copper brazed in a hydrogen furnace, and turned out a very lightweight 60-pound engine. It produced 26.5 horsepower, and certainly this was a phenomenal horsepower to weight ratio. Well, when they put it in an automobile, the thing that happened is you had a steel product completely welded with copper, and you would put water in it or alcohol-based antifreeze, and you suddenly almost had a battery action, a corrosive action that would literally destroy the engine from the inside out. Many, many thousands of them failed, and this put a bad taste in the public's mouth.
Crosley replaced the so-called tin engine with an iron block model that was far more reliable. But world events were also conspiring against him. The Korean War broke out. That raised the price of raw materials and labor. The Crosley car became more and more expensive to build and to buy. By 1952, it was all over. The car that was ahead of its time was no more. Crosley had lost over $1 million a year for the last 3 years that the car was produced.
In 1952, when the company went out of production, this was just about 4 or 5 years before the small car then became its own. If you remember the Rambler, the Falcon, Volkswagen, all came to be in 56, 57, and certainly then he would have been very much in place with the product he was trying to sell.
The fans of the little Crosley car did not disappear. They exist today as the Crosley Automobile Club.
We're at right about 800 members now from across the United States, Alaska, a member in Hawaii, another member in Uruguay, one in Israel, and quite a few in Canada. And the Crosley people are really fanatics about the Crosley.
Once you start one, it's like getting girls, you know, you like them all. They're really nice, you know, it gets in your blood, I guess.
Once the grease is under your fingernails, you're hooked.
You adopt Crosleys, you don't buy them. Or they adopt you.
Well, nobody owns just one. You can't own just one.
I have given each one of my kids an automobile.
And I'm restoring my 6th one now, which will go to my daughter.
Crosley would have appreciated the love and affection that collectors shower on his automobiles.
How many Crosleys do I have? There's at least 50. I believe the main object here is to preserve history of Powel Crosley's endeavors, and I try to get them as exactly like they were when they were new as I can, because that's the main object here.
Powel Crosley was heartbroken when his automobile was forced to go out of production. This we know. It meant a lot to him. It was more than just a machine. And to him, it was a dream.
He was crazy about automobiles. He was up to the day he died.
This is the home that Powel Crosley built for himself and his family. It now serves as an office building here on the grounds of Providence Hospital in Mount Airy. It was designed to be a copy of a stately English manor house, and Crosley imported both the materials and the craftsmen to build it.
Unfortunately, within a few years of its completion, he was to suffer the first of many tragedies that were to haunt his personal life. He lost his wife of 28 years, Gwendolyn, after a heartbreaking and lingering illness. He married 3 times more. 2 marriages were brief and ended in divorce. A third lasted only 4 years and ended with the loss of his 3rd wife, Eva, to cancer. His only son, Powel Crosley III, was the victim of a bizarre accident when he suffered a fatal allergic reaction to an insect sting. His grandson, Powel Crosley IV, was killed in Korea just days before the final truce of the Korean War. From the time of the illness of his first wife, Crosley kept up a brave front. He plunged into his work and ferociously pursued his hobbies. He was an avid sportsman. He loved to get away from the pressure of work to hunt or to fish. He had vacation retreats in Canada, Indiana, Florida, and on Bull Island in South Carolina. He was fond of the sea and kept a succession of large and luxurious yachts in Florida. He was an enthusiastic aviator with a fascination for the wonders of man-made flight. During the 30s, he had even designed and built his own plane. He called it the Moonbeam. He owned a number of airplanes, and he was constantly working on ideas to make flights safer and to improve existing aircraft design. He served for many years on the board of directors of TWA. His niece, Lyda Montgomery, remembers with affection the excitement of early flights in Uncle Powell's flying machines.
I was 7 years old when I flew the first time, and in his plane. And now we flew from where we were in Florida to St. Petersburg for lunch. Well, I mean, it was a hydroplane. I can remember landing on the beach the whole bit. It was a terrible experience, but we made it.
There was another important aspect to Powel Crosley's life that had a major impact on the city he loved. In 1934, when it looked as though the Cincinnati Reds might be bought and moved to another city, Crosley stepped in and bought the franchise.
To Cincinnati sports fans, that was Powel Crosley's greatest gift to the city. When I was a kid, I sat in these Crosley Field seats and gave thanks to Powel Crosley for keeping my beloved Red Legs where I could watch them. The nostalgia for those glory-filled years is evident today here in Blue Ash. This is a replica of old Crosley Field created by loving fans years after the original gave way to urban renewal. They appreciated the sports legacy that Crosley gave to his beloved city. And make no mistake about his commitment to saving the Reds for Cincinnati.
The New York offered him a certain amount of money for the Reds. He said, I'm not going to sell them because they belong in Cincinnati.
He had a love of Cincinnati. A lot of people didn't think so, but he absolutely did.
Soon after Crosley acquired the team, he upgraded the ballpark and renamed it Crosley Field. He became an ardent fan and hired the management talent whose names are now legend. Larry McPhail, Warren Giles, Chuck Dressen, Gabe Paul, and Bill McKechnie, to name a few. He gave the acknowledged dean of American sportscasters his first job when he hired a young Red Barber to do play-by-play for the Reds. And he was understanding enough to let the young sportscaster go when Barber's youthful ambitions outgrew Cincinnati and he took a job in New York.
Well, when Mr. Crosley heard that, he sent for me and he said, I'd like to have you stay in Cincinnati. and I'll put you in charge of sports, and I'll guarantee you that you can make $16,000 a year, which was a lot of money. And I said, well, thank you very much, Mr. Crosley, I appreciate it. But I'm going to go to New York. Well, he said, why? I said, for the same reason you went broke 5 or 6 times before you came up with WLW. He got up, came around the desk, shook hands, and said, I understand. You want a bigger opportunity. I said, yeah, thank you.
He became a frequent visitor to Crosley Field and traveled with the team when he could find the time. In spite of his intense interest in the Reds, he gave his managers a free hand, and he respected their judgment. Gabe Paul tells what it was like to work for Powel Crosley as the Reds' general manager.
First of all, he was brilliant. I don't think many people realize how brilliant he was, and I've thought back many times over the years at some of the things that he said and how well they proved out. You want to be consulted on things, but he let you make up your own mind. He didn't attempt to be a smart baseball man. He had the greatest common denominator of all. He had common sense. He was really an ideal owner. I didn't realize at the time, or I never would have left. There aren't many things that I regret that happened in the 58 years I was in baseball, but I think I regret more than anything having left him.
It wasn't just the team that Crosley brought to the city in the game of baseball. He brought us this, night baseball. Now, Wrigley Field is just getting the benefit of night baseball, but Cincinnati has had it for over 50 years. Gabe Paul remembers vividly Crosley's reaction when Larry MacPhail told him he would like the Reds to play at night.
Larry MacPhail is the father of lights, but lights in the major leagues came about when Larry spoke to Crosley and told him that if they could only have one night game a week, that it would be like adding another Sunday. Sunday was the big attendance day, and Crosley said, why don't we have lights? He said, because the league would not allow it. He said, well, have we ever tried it? Have we ever approached them on it? Larry said, no. And he said, well, let's try it. And sure enough, they did get permission to play 7 games at night, which was increased to 14, and then went gradually up.
In 1934, Crosley equipped his ballpark with lights, and the Reds made history when they played the first night game in the major leagues. It was an innovation that increased the number of fans who could regularly enjoy the sport.
Crosley was pictured as a very frugal man, but he wasn't at all. He was willing to spend on something that he thought was worth spending for. He had a very good expression that he used to use often, say, let's spend smarter dollars. It's very sound.
We have shown you some of the significant contributions made by Powel Crosley to 20th century living. We have seen only the highlights. Any one of them could provide a program of its own. But a recounting of accomplishments tells us little about the personality of the man. What was Powel Crosley really like? We turned to the people who knew him and found some contradictions and much agreement.
You wouldn't dare call Powell by his first name.
Always Mr. Crosley, never Powell.
We called him the boss, and he was everybody's boss.
He was a very definite person.
My brother was very determined.
Frankly, a very aloof type person.
He wasn't real big on showing his emotions.
Well, I think he was a fascinating man.
To me, he was exciting.
He was a natural born salesman.
Inventive.
His mind never stopped working.
He loved to tinker.
He wanted to be the Ford of radio.
He was a person that was very uneasy or bored if he didn't have something new coming.
He was a go-getter.
He always had something going.
He always had a goal.
He was always looking ahead.
A lot of imagination.
He was a genius.
Tremendous ideas.
Every time he opened his mouth, it was interesting.
He was very outgoing.
Gentleman from the word go.
Tall.
Very tall man.
Always dressed to the nines.
I wouldn't say he was terribly handsome.
S-U-A-V-E, suave.
Well, he preferred younger people.
I think he liked the ladies.
And he enjoyed dating.
And I think the ladies liked him.
When he worked hard.
He didn't settle for inferior stuff.
But when he played the same way. He played hard.
He had a hearty laugh.
He never put on the dog.
He could have a very funny side, a very, very serious side.
Fair, honest.
He was very casual.
He had common sense.
Stick-to-itiveness.
Never saw him lose his temper.
He had a pretty rough character at times.
He didn't want anybody poaching in on him.
You might say opinionated.
He hung on like a bulldog until he accomplished his objectives.
In a nutshell, he knew what he was doing.
Because he certainly wasn't boring.
I think he would have been happiest if the car had done as well as he had hoped.
Did everything possible to get that dream developed.
I realize now what an outstanding man he was.
Everybody referred to him as the boss.
The boss. He was the boss.
And we all loved him.
Powel Crosley Jr. died in 1961. During his lifetime, he had become an entrepreneur, inventor, radio broadcaster, industrialist, businessman, sportsman, automobile developer, a dreamer of dreams, and a provider of modern-day miracles to the American public. Powel Crosley helped to make our 20th century dreams come true. Surely, there can be no more fitting epitaph.